Hello everyone and welcome to another video of Barrel and Glass. I'm Trissa and I'm here to talk about your alcohol. And today we have the William Lawson's blended Scotch whiskey. So the William Lawson's history is very rich and dynamic and expands to over a century ago. So we're going to have a brief look into the history. The origins of the William Lawsons can be traced back to the year 1849 when William Lawson, who was a Scottish businessman, immigrated to Ireland. So he was initially working in Dublin for E&J Burke, which is a very well-known bottling and blending company that was specialized in whiskey exports. And in the year 1889, while William was still working here, he registered the name Lawson & Co. Dundee and introduced his first whiskey called as the Lawson's Liquor Whiskey. And Dundee, Scotland was chosen for registration, which suggested the Scottish ties, even though Lawson was based from Ireland. And at that time, unlike other traditional whiskies, which incorporated peated malts, Lawson's whiskey was non-peated, making it smoother and more accessible. If you're hearing the word peated or unpeated for the first time, I'm just going to quickly talk about that. Peated barley is dried using peat smoke, which gives it like a smoky finish, whereas unpeated does not incorporate that smoky finish. It leaves the malt in a much cleaner, maltier flavor, if you can call it that. So his blending approach focused on high malt content, which set it apart from other grain-heavy competitors. Now, when we come to the early 20th century, the William Lawson whiskey has undergone a lot of changes and difficulties because after Lawson's departure in 1903, the company underwent a period of uncertainty because it had several ownership transitions. It also faced a lot of other hurdles because there was the issues it faced because of World War I and the prohibition in the US, and then came World War II. So it was a lot of uncertainties going on for the brand. Then finally in 1953, the brand was acquired by Clanmurno Whisky Limited, which was a company that was looking to expand their portfolio. The company, to distinguish this product from other, they officially rebranded it as William Lawson's. That was in around the late 1950s. And then came the next shift. The Italian spirits company Martini and Rossi acquired William Lawson's, and the production was then relocated to Coatbridge because originally it was in Dundee, and Coatbridge is a town in Scotland known for its whiskey heritage. And then Martini and Rossi purchased the Macduff distillery to secure like a steady supply of single malt to the William Lawson's, and because of which the Macduff's single malt became the core malt component in the blend. And then finally in 1993 to the present, the takeover of Bacardi happens. The global rum giant Bacardi Limited acquired Martini and Rossi, bringing the William Lawson's under their control. And yes, that is a huge history lesson, if you might, but this is everything that happened for this brand to get here and to be what it is today. There are a few key features to how this whiskey stood the test of time and became so successful. I would say the very first reason is the smooth and non-peated taste that they provide, which was considered as a beginner friendly. This became an appeal to a huge or a larger audience that were not used to or not seasoned in the peated whiskey taste. Another reason would be their pricing is pretty affordable, which makes it a great alternative compared to other premium brands, and because of which today it remains one of the top selling blended Scotch whiskies worldwide. Now let's dive into what exactly this whiskey is made up of. We're going to have a quick look into the ingredients that is used to make this whiskey. The very first ingredient is the malted barley. If you're not aware, malted barley is the backbone of all Scottish whiskies. And the William Lawson sources their main malt whiskey component from the Macduff distillery. I had mentioned earlier in the history when the Macduff distillery was involved in the William Lawson. So Bacardi sources it from the Macduff distilleries. The second key ingredient is the grain whiskey, which is made up of two things, that is corn and wheat. Even though it's not publicly disclosed as to where exactly they source it from, it is most likely sourced from major grain distilleries in Scotland, that is either Cambridge or North British Distillery. And then we come to the third main ingredient, which is water. Now water is a very crucial ingredient in every stage of the whiskey production, whether it be for mashing or fermentation or dilution. It plays a very important role. And the William Lawson source their water most likely uses the Scottish spring water. And then we have the fourth and final ingredient that is used for making the whiskey, which is yeast. And William Lawson uses a combination of brewer's yeast and distiller's yeast. So now let's move on to the production process, understanding the production process of the William Lawson's blended Scotch whiskey. So we're going to go through each and every step, and I'm going to try and explain each and every step to the maximum detail. So the very first step in the production process is malting. When it comes to the blended Scotch whiskey, there are two whiskies that is added. One is the malt whiskey and the grain whiskey. So when it comes to the malting, this is particularly done for the malt whiskies part of it. So I'm going to first talk about the malt whiskey. So what exactly is malting? It is the process of preparing the malt for the fermentation process, which is the next process. So how exactly is this done? The barley is soaked in water for 48 to 72 hours to germinate. And the barley is spread on malting floors or in large germination drums. And then what happens? The enzymes are activated, which converts the starch into fermentable sugar, or also called as maltose. And this germinated barley is dried using hot air or in a kiln. This drying process does not use peating, which is one of the standing features of this whiskey that is non-peated. So for the drying process, they use hot air. This is the process of malting, which is the second step. And this process is only done on the malt whiskey production and not on the grain whiskey production, which then takes us to the second step of the production process, which is the mashing. So the purpose of mashing is to extract the sugars from the barley. What exactly happens in this mashing process? Once the malt is dried, it is ground into a flour-like consistency, which is called as the grist. And this grist is mixed with hot water in a large vessel called as the mash tun. And through this process, we can extract the sugars from the barley, which gives us like a sweet liquid called as the wort. Now, this extraction process is done in 3 rounds. The very first round is called as the first water, which is the hot water. The temperature of the hot water will be around 65 degrees Celsius, which kind of like extracts most of the sugar. Then they add the second water, which will be at a temperature of 75 degrees Celsius, which extracts the sugar further. And then another round of hot water at a temperature of 85 degrees Celsius is added. This extracts any remaining, the final extraction of the sugar. And whatever is left, the husk is removed. And usually this husk is later used for kind of like cattle feeding or whatever. So that the husk is then finally removed after the 3 rounds of extraction or water infusion. And then the resulting wort, or this sugar-rich liquid, is moved into tanks for the next step in the production process, which brings us to the third step to the production process, which is fermentation. So the purpose of fermentation is to convert the sugar into alcohol, which then creates the base flavor of the whiskey. So how exactly is the fermentation process done is the wort is cooled to around 20 to 25 degrees Celsius before the yeast is added, and then the yeast ferments the sugar, producing the alcohol. And this process, the fermentation process, lasts for around 48 to 72 hours, producing like a beer-like liquid called as wash. And the alcohol content for this liquid would be around 8% ABV. And then we move on to the next step in the production process, which is the fourth step, which is distillation. This helps in like concentrating the alcohol flavors. Again, here we are using a blend. We are talking about a blended Scotch whiskey. So we have two separate distillation process for the distillation process for the grain whiskey is different from the malt whiskey. So first we'll talk about the malt whiskey. For the malt whiskey, traditional copper pot stills is used at the Macduff distillery, and the wash is distilled twice. The first distillation, or called as the wash still, converts the wash from 8% ABV into something called as low wines, which increases the alcohol content to around 20 to 25% ABV. And then the second distillation is done, the spirit still, which produces the final spirit, which has again pushed the alcohol content to 65 to 70% ABV. And then we are left with three parts of the liquid: the head, heart and tail. What we need is the heart, because the head contains volatile alcohol which is removed, and the tail contains heavy oil. So the head and the tail is removed, leaving only the heart of the spirit. And now if you look at the distillation process for the grain whiskey, till now we were talking about the malt whiskey. Now if you talk about the distillation of the grain whiskies, grain whiskey is distilled in continuous column stills, which produces a light high strength spirit which around 85 to 90% ABV. And then we come to the fifth step in the production process, which is maturation. So if you look at the Scottish law as such, the Scotch whiskey must be aged for a minimum of 3 years in oak casks. Now in William Lawson, it is primarily aged in American oak barrels that were previously used for bourbons. So the purpose of using the pre-bourbon cask adds two distinctive things. One is the vanilla and caramel sweetness to the whiskey. The second is the toasted wood and nutty flavor to it. For this, the fifth step, which was the maturation, the whiskies are stored in warehouses with natural temperature to aid with the maturation process. And in William Lawson, the maturation process takes up to 3 to 5 years before moving on to the next step in the production process, the sixth step, which is the blending process. William Lawson, as I have mentioned earlier, is a blended Scotch whiskey, which means it's a combination of two whiskies. We spoke about both malt whiskey and the grain whiskey. The malt whiskey from the Macduff distillery and the grain whiskey from a large Scottish distillery. And blending of these two will give it a signature flavor, consistency in the signature flavor. So for this, a very important person, which is the master distiller, is the one who determines how much and which ones to choose. So he or she selects the aged malt and the grain whiskies needed for the blending process. So the chosen whiskies are put into large vats and is allowed to marry for a short period. And then we move on to the very final step, which is the dilution and the bottling. So before the bottling process, the alcohol strength is adjusted to a standard 40% ABV using pure water. and then the whiskey undergoes something called as a chill filtration to remove any haze causing oils, and then finally it goes for the bottling and packaging and distribution process. Let's talk about the bottle itself. So what we have is the 1 liter bottle with us. So the William Lawson's whiskey comes in a tall bottle which is easy to handle with a rounded shoulder. So the bottle is made of green glass, which is very common for your Scotch whiskies. This is to protect the whiskey from sunlight. The brand itself is just the name, it's very minimalistic, and most of the William Lawsons come with an illustration of William Lawson, and in the background in the illustration you will be able to see a vintage imagery. They use a screw cap made of metal for ease of resealing the bottle. You can also see the alcohol percents and other details are given here. This is at 40% ABV. It is clearly mentioned that this is a product of Scotland. That means it is distilled and aged in Scotland itself. You have also the little crest here. And finally, coming to the pricing of this is priced between 70 to 90 dirhams in the UAE, which is $23 to $25 in the US. So what sets this whiskey apart from the other whiskeys out there? The very first thing we spoke about earlier as well is the no peat, no smoke, just smooth whiskey. So this makes it one of the smoothest whiskeys out there. The second thing is that the malt whiskey content for the William Lawson's is much higher than other whiskies out there, which has a higher proportion of the grain whiskey. And one other unique thing is this does not have an age statement. So if you've heard other premium brands, they tell, oh, this is 15 years old, 18 years old, 20 years old. The William Lawson does not release such an age statement, but experts say it should be around 3 to 5 because they mostly focus on the consistency of the flavor, so they do not release an age statement for their whiskey. Then finally, this whiskey compared to other whiskeys, a lot of other whiskeys focus on tradition, heritage and luxury, whereas the William Lawson goes by the tagline no rules, great Scotch, which kind of like appeals to a much younger crowd or beginner friendly whiskey drinkers. And this is one of the whiskeys that is very easy to use while making cocktails, whereas a lot of whiskeys out there is usually enjoyed neat or on the rock. This is because of it has a very smooth and easy to drink kind of a consistency or flavor. So it is much easier to incorporate this into cocktails. Now let's move on to the much awaited smell test and the taste test. So I'm going to go ahead and open this and give it a good first whiff. Ooh, the first thing that the smell reminds me is of something that came like something like that was freshly baked. Like it's giving like a very nice vanilla caramelly scent to it. A nice little warm malty sweetness is also there, like lingering. It's very nice to smell. So I can't wait to give this a try. So I'm gonna go ahead and pour this in a glass. I'm so excited to taste this. Ooh. It's actually very smooth. So the first sip gives you like a very smooth, like a toffee-ish taste. It does not hit you very hard. It goes in very smooth. I would say it gives like a very clean, fresh finish. So on the mouthfeel is not too thick. It's very light on the mouth as well, which makes it like very easy to drink. It has a very slight velvety texture, not too oily or thick. It's very slight velvety texture, making it feel like creamy, you could say. So once it goes in on the finish, you can feel like a very soft spice lingering. Now let's talk about the food pairings that go with this whiskey. A very classic thing to pair whiskeys are with cheese. So you can pair it with cheese like a mild cheddar cheese or a brie, Gouda cheese, or goat cheese. Grilled meat and roasted poultry goes great with this. Desserts that are like caramel based, or a chocolate mousse, apple pie, or an apple tart, and then of course nuts, dried fruits also goes or pairs amazing with this whiskey. Spicy and Asian cuisine also goes really well with this whiskey. Now coming to the cocktails that you can make with this whiskey, you can make your classic whiskey sour, and then we have the next one, which is Scotch and ginger. Whiskey and cola is another popular cocktail that you can have with this. Option is the old-fashioned. Rusty nail is also like a recommended cocktail that you can make with this. And there are of course a few other options that you can try. So this whiskey actually works really well while making cocktails, like I mentioned earlier, and it's an overall great experience. And it has an overall well-balanced sweet taste, which makes it easier to make cocktails with. So that's it for today's video. If you enjoy the kind of content that I take, don't forget to click on the like, share and subscribe button, and I will see you next time. Cheers.